Day, rather, in February. The rain is kind of a nice backdrop for what we're doing this morning on Noah and the ark. Fortunately, he didn't have to do anything with snow, and we didn't have to build an ark. But if you close your eyes real tight and don't ask me to sing, then you can pretend I'm Steph. Other than that, then you're stuck with me for the teacher this morning. So anyway, we've got a lot to unpack this morning, and so let's start out. You got a handout. If any of you didn't get any, Steph's got some extras here and she can pass them out to you. And James Ussher was a 17th century archbishop in the Church of Ireland. And he was very interested in biblical chronology. So what he did was take the Old Testament genealogies and he went all the way back as far as he could to get a timeline of the approximate date of creation. Now, we could get off on a real rabbit trail on that because in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 is the story of what happened to the earth. But this was for the recreation, and so that was set at approximately 4004 BC. So the date of the flood was set at 2348 BC, which was 1656 years later. Now, one of the interesting things about this, if you follow NASA at all, you will know that they can have the constellations and what the sky looked like thousands upon thousands of years ago. And at the time when Noah was building the ark, there was a comet that came through there. And the Bible says that there are signs that are in the sun and the moon and the stars. And the comet that came through there was called Hale-Bopp. Not at the time, but that's what came through in our world in 1998. And so Jesus said that leading up to the time when his return would be close, that it would be as in the days of Noah. So I just found it very interesting that that same comet was in the time of Noah, and it came through again in 1998. Now, lifespans back then were very long. If you'll look at your handout here, you can find that Adam lived for 930 years. Seth, 912 years. I mean, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be living that long. 50 years old would be still considered a teenager back then. I hope that puberty didn't last that long. But anyway, can you imagine a couple in the delivery room? They're 300 years old. They've just had their 128th kid. They have a home with 70 bedrooms, and they're trying to come up with a new name for this child on there. So this was some of the things that they would have gone through at this time. But what was interesting is to find out who was still alive during this time. If you look at the time when Adam died, which was in 930, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, all of these people were alive, at the time before Adam died. And when Noah was born, you look back 2 generations up was Methuselah. He lived 969 years. He was the longest living man on the earth. Now, the birth of Noah and his sons, let's turn to Genesis chapter 5 and verses 28 to 32. Genesis chapter 5, 28 to 32. Now, Lamech was the father of Noah, and it says Lamech lived 182 years. He begat a son. He called his name Noah, saying, "The same will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years, begat sons and daughters, and all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Noah was 500 years old, and he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the name of Methuselah in Hebrew means his death shall bring judgment. Now, names meant something in those days. When a parent looked at a child, they would give that child a name that they thought that he would become in his life, or something perhaps that occurred at birth. For example, if you remember when the grandson of Eli was born, his daughter-in-law called him Ichabod because he said the glory of God has departed. So names meant something. And so there had to have been a prophecy of judgment that was passed down that the people knew about, because if his name meant his death shall bring judgment, then somehow his parents knew that when this man died, that there was going to be a judgment that came upon the earth. So everyone would be watching for the time of his death. The guy got a sniffle, and they'd be thinking, okay, is this it? Is he going to pass away? And is something bad going to happen? Now, the grandfather, he was the grandfather of Noah, and he died just before the flood. In fact, Jewish rabbis will say that this was something that perhaps occurred like a week before the flood. But he lived longer than any other human being, and this shows the mercy of God. He made it as long as possible, hoping that people would repent during that time. Now let's look at the conditions on the earth pre-flood. Go to Genesis chapter 6 and verses 1 to 6. It came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. Now, we're going to get into this in just a minute. Notice that it says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, and yet his days will be 120 years. Now notice at this time, God had already decided the lifespan is going to go down here. Okay. And there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them, and the same became mighty men, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Now, the sons of God refers to angelic beings. They took on flesh. They took on a human being. Again, Jewish rabbis will say that these were sent down to the earth to teach men the ways of God. However, when they took on a human body, the normal urges that would happen in a human being overcame them, and they ended up in sin. They produced giants or unnatural children, and there have actually been fossil findings of bones of people who were 10, 12, even 13 feet high. Beds that were made that were like 6 feet long, 6 feet wide. Huge people that were born during those days. Now, Job 1:6 says that the sons of God, including Satan, would come before the Lord and present themselves before the Lord. And also, Jude 6 talks about the punishments of angels who did not keep their first estate. They are kept in chains of darkness because of the sin of corrupting the human race. Now, what happened is that the actions, because the sons of God corrupted the human race at this time, that this contaminated the bloodline on here. So in Genesis 6:9, if you go on down, one verse, it says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Now, this doesn't mean that Noah was without sin, that he never did anything wrong. What this means is that he and his forebears, his ancestors, had not in any way contaminated the bloodline by intermingling with these sons of God. So, in Genesis 6, 11 to 13, it says, the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So God got to the point where after 656 years, he looked down and he said, this isn't working. It was really bad. The whole earth was filled with violence. Every imagination of every person's heart was filled with evil. And God had grief. It broke his heart to see what happened with this. So God began to form a plan with Noah, and he gave some instructions to him. In that same chapter, Genesis 6, and verses 14 to 22. He said, make an ark of gopher wood. Now, I looked this up, and they don't know what this wood actually was. There was not an equivalent, because when the temple was built, the ark, or the materials inside there, were usually made of acacia wood, but they're not really sure what this kind of wood was. But you will pitch it within and without with pitch. Now, the Hebrew word for pitch actually means atonement. So this is really interesting. So inside the ark and outside the ark, it was covered with atonement. So even in the middle of judgment, there was mercy and there was an atonement coming. God made a way out. And this is the fashion that you will make it: 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. And you make a window and finish it above and put a door in it, first, second, and third stories. And it says, and behold, I will bring a flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh from under heaven, and everything on the earth shall die. But I'll establish my covenant with you. You'll come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you, and of every living thing of all flesh that you will bring into the ark to keep them alive, male and female, of fowls after their kind, cattle after their kind, creeping thing of the earth after the kind, two of every sort shall come to you to keep them alive. And you'll take unto thee all food that is eaten, and you will gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. And Noah did according to what God commanded him. Now, the dimensions of the ark. This was like a 3-story cruise ship. I mean, it was not just a little boat that floated on the water. Sometimes we see some depictions of this, and we don't know the actual shape of the ark. We don't know whether it was flat-bottomed, whether it had a keel on it, what it looked like. But the dimensions were probably using what's called the Hebrew long cubit, and this was 20.4 inches. And this would make the ark 510 feet by 85 feet by 51 feet. It was huge. You could put in it 3 space capsules, or it would also be the storage capacity of 450 standard semi-trailers. Huge, absolutely huge. So a study by a Korean ship research center said that these boats could handle waves up to 100 feet. Because when everything happened on here, it would not just be a nice little floating on a nice little lake. It would pitch for a while. It would be very, very bad. I'm glad that I wasn't Noah's wife, because there was no Dramamine back then, and I would have been terribly seasick. I don't do well on boats. So anyway, the storage capacity, as I said, could hold up to 120,000 sheep and 450 standard semis. And then the further instructions on there is that they were to gather 2 of every animal and to gather food for both humans and animals. Now, sometimes when we have a casual reading of all of this, we miss little details and we miss what it would have been like to actually have been on this boat at this time. The exact length of time as far as building the ark is unknown. But if you read in here that Noah was how old when he had these children? He was 500 years old. And when he had these kids on here, there were no modern construction techniques, there was no equipment, but it could be up to 100 years for building this ark. There were no blueprints, there were no computer models, no cell phones, there wasn't even paper and pens. So even trying to get the instructions, I'm sure that Noah had to ask the Lord more than once, now, what did you say to do with this? I can imagine what it would have been like on this. Now, when he had these animals come on board, let's read in Genesis chapter 7 and verses 2 and 3. Of every clean beast you will take to yourself by 7s, the male and his female, and the beasts who are not clean by 2, the male and his female, of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep seed alight upon the face of the earth. Now, most people think that when these animals came on there, that there were just 2 of every kind. But the reason why there were 7 is that after Noah got off the ark, he had to have some animals for sacrifice. So that's why these were on the ark as well. So this not only preserved every species, but some became sacrifices to God later. Now, think about this at the time. Here were these boys who were born at the time, and we're thinking that they possibly were triplets, because when the Bible talks about births, it says, and so bore so-and-so, and later on it says, and she bore so-and-so. But it says Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So very likely they were triplets, and that's because God needed an instant building crew to build this thing. I mean, it was going to take a long time. When you think they did not have cranes, they did not have anything to do this, and you can imagine what the people around them must have been thinking at the time. Like, what are you doing? I don't know if any of you baby boomers have ever heard of Bill Cosby and his monologue on Noah and the Ark, but if you've ever seen this, I see a couple people nodding. That's hilarious. Google it, because it was, you just cannot imagine what the neighbors must have thought with Noah building this ark at this time, and like, what's this for? Now, I remember one pastor saying this, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but in the garden, there was no such thing as rain. It says that a mist rose up from the ground, and it watered the earth. So whether there was rain from this time on, we don't know, because the first mention of rain is when it started with a flood. So we don't know whether there was rain. I'm assuming that there was. But in the garden, there was no such thing as rain. It was just a mist that watered the earth. So think about this with the animals, that God had to bring the animals and the birds to Noah. Now, I'm thinking that God had to use his supernatural air cargo to bring some of these animals, because there were some that were not native to the area. I mean, you think about penguins, you think about lions and bears and buffaloes, and in Madagascar, which I've been to, it's an island off of the east coast of Africa, there are some species there that are native only to Madagascar. So God had to bring these supernaturally to Adam. So you can imagine elephants flying through the air and landing at the point where they were, and also God had to make sure that one was male and one was female. So they were coming in there. The birds had to come in. And there was a supernatural prevention of these animals attacking each other, because the lions would see the lambs and automatically think that lunch was on the way. So he had to protect these animals from destroying each other while they were on the ark. Now, obviously, he would have to put the larger animals on the bottom to balance everything out, and the smaller ones on the top. He also had to preserve the food on there. You think about this, that how long they were on the ark, and we'll get to this in just a minute, but the food preservation was not the same like we have today. They didn't have modern canning, they didn't have frozen foods, they didn't have anything. God supernaturally preserved this food, both for the people and for the animals. And I like to think that maybe at some point he also had to multiply it, because there was going to be a lot of food that was going to be consumed by these animals. And they had to care for the physical needs of all of these animals, of the feeding, the cleanup, and also the Lord had to withhold reproduction. We all know how the mice and the rabbits are. So he had to do something about protecting this, and also with human reproduction, because it would have been very difficult for the daughters-in-law to have had children while on board the boat. It just would not have been convenient. Now, let's look at the flood in chapter 7 and verse 1. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come, you and all your house, into the ark, for I have seen you righteous before me in this generation. Go on down to verse 4. For yet 7 days, and I'll cause it to rain on the earth 40 days, 40 nights, and every living substance that I've made will I destroy from the face of the earth. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. So if you look at these verses, you can see that from the time that God gave the first command, which was when he was 500, up until the time that he was 600, somewhere in that time it took up to 100 years in building this ark. Long time. But it was also the mercy of God, because I'm sure that during this time that Noah was preaching, he was trying to say, hey, there's something coming during this time. Remember, Methuselah was still alive during this time. And Noah kept saying, there's something coming, there's something coming. I am building an ark. And everyone would have had the opportunity to get into the ark, but no one took him up on it because no one believed on this. So, and then in, verse 7, it says, So Noah went in, his sons, his wives, and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Now remember that at the point where Methuselah dies, this was right before the flood. We don't know exactly how long, but many scholars are thinking that it was about a week before the flood, because here mercy ends, judgment begins. Now, Noah's family was inside the ark 7 days before the rains came, and you're thinking, well, why would this happen? Because in Jewish burial rites, 7 days was the time of mourning for a family member. So if Methuselah had just passed away during this time, then God allowed Noah and his family to mourn for him during this time. Now, when nothing happened immediately after Methuselah's death, you're thinking day one, and the people outside see Noah and all these animals and all the people going into the ark, and God shuts the door. And so day one, nothing happens. Methuselah's dead. Must not be anything to this. Day two, nothing happens. Day three, day four, day 5, day 6. And so I can imagine the laughter outside when the people were saying, nothing's going to happen. Day 7 arrived. Verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, and the 17th day of the month, in the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, a lot of times we think that when the flood came, all it was just rain that happened. Well, that would have taken a very, very long time for the earth to be covered, especially the mountains. But here, remember this little verse in here that says, the great fountains of the deep were broken up. So not only did the rain come down, but the water came up from underneath on here. It was not just rain, it was water from underneath. And I looked up just to see how much water was underneath the ground, and it says 3 times the amount in the oceans combined. That's how much water is inside the earth. So that was amazing to me, and I cannot even imagine the panic of the people that were there. That when they were seeing not only all this water coming down from heaven, but all of a sudden the ground underneath them opens up and the waters come out. It was a deluge. It would have been like what the tsunami was when it happened in Banda Aceh and in East Asia during this time. Now, let's take a look at the time on the ark. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, and chapter 8 and 14, because it says that they went into the ark in here. Let's back up in chapter 7. I'm sorry, Seth. So in verse 15, they went into the ark, Noah and 2 and 2 of all flesh. They went in, male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him. And in verse 17, and the flood was 40 days upon the earth. The waters increased, bore up the ark, and was lifted up above the earth. The waters prevailed and were increased greatly on the earth. The ark went upon the face of the waters. The waters prevailed exceedingly, covered all the high hills, and then 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl, cattle, beast, and of every creeping thing, and every man. And every living substance was destroyed, which was on the face of the ground, both man, cattle, creeping thing, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed. And the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. So in Genesis 8, chapter 14, this is when the earth was dried, but let's look at what happens in between them. The total length of time, according to when it happened, here it says that back in Genesis 7:11, 600th year in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month, up until the time in Genesis 8:14, when the earth was dried, was 371 days. It was not just the 40 days and 40 nights and all of a sudden the water disappeared and they got out of the ark. They were on that ark a long time, 371 days. So what did they do during this time? It wasn't exactly like the Carnival Cruise Line. They didn't have shuffleboard, they didn't have a swimming pool, they didn't have onboard movies, they did not have the buffets, but they still had a lot to do. First of all was the care of the animals. So all of them had to deal with this. They not only had to groom them, feed them, but clean up the mess. And they didn't have elevators during this time, so you can imagine what it was like to haul out the emission and dump it outside. This was quite a job during this time. And I'm sure that there was lots of bedtime stories, because Noah had 500 years of memories of, well, when I was a boy, 500 years ago. So there would have been a lot of storytelling, a lot of possibly journaling things during this time, and also they didn't have electricity, so it would have been some kind of lighting lanterns, things like that. So I'm sure they fell into bed every night. Noah's wife, daughters-in-law found 371 ways to fix pancakes. So they would have had their own recipe book during this time. They also had supernatural protection against illness, reproduction, and seasickness. Finally, the rain stops, and they float for a long time. Now in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1, it said, "And God remembered Noah." And not that he ever forgot him, but what he's saying is that, okay, we're about to start a new beginning. He remembered Noah and every living thing, all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth. I can imagine what that would have sounded like in there, because it was enough to make the waters part during this time. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. The waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. Now the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And where they are thinking that this is someplace in Turkey. There have been a lot of excursions into where they think that the ark is today. No one knows for sure, but they're thinking that this is someplace in Turkey, which will not let anybody explore in there, so we don't know for sure on there. But the waters decreased continually, verse 5, until the 10th month, and on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And then at the end of 40 days, Noah opened up the window of the ark, and he sent out a raven. And that raven flew back and forth, but couldn't find any place to land. So he came back. Noah pulled him back into the ark. And about a week later, he sent out a dove, and the dove found no place for her foot either. Waited another 7 days, sent out the dove, and this time she brought back a little olive leaf in her beak. So he knew that by this time the tops of the trees were able to be seen, that there was some greenery on the earth during this time. Waited another 7 days, sent out the dove again, and this time the dove didn't come back. She found a place to land. And so it says in verse 13, "And it came to pass in the 601st year, the first month, first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the face of the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and the face of the ground was dry. But it wasn't dry down underneath. It was just the surface that was dry." And so in verse 14, in the 2nd month, the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth totally dried. And then God spoke to Noah and said, "Go forth from the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives, and bring forth every living thing that's with you, that you may breed abundantly in the earth, be fruitful, and multiply upon the earth." So they were finally off the earth. And you know, when I looked at this, I began to think, well, what would it have been like from God's perspective? What would he have thought? Because when we read the word on here, it's told like a narrative on this of someone else describing what happened during this time. But imagine what God must have felt during this time. He was looking back and thinking of that first time. And I remember driving home one time from church and just talking to the Lord, and I was saying, God, what was it like in the very beginning? The very beginning, before there was anything, before there was angels, before there was light, before there was anything. And instantly, the answer came back, lonely. And I was kind of surprised. I wasn't expecting that answer from the Lord, but that's what it was like. And so in God's heart, he created something to love him, something to worship in. So he created the angels. And he gave them free will, just as he gave us free will during this time. And most of them followed him. Some, as you know, did not. Satan, of course, being the leader of that. And that's what started the whole mess. And that's what started everything happening with the earth being form or becoming form and void. Because if you look at that word in Genesis, it says, and the earth was without form. It actually, the Hebrew word is become without form and void. But that's another whole subject during this time. And so we don't know how long it was between Genesis 1:1 and 2. But then God looked down and he said, I'm going to start anew. And he made his greatest creation, man. And he put within him, first of all, a God-shaped void. Something that would love him, that would turn to him when he needed him. And Adam and Eve were created to live forever in the garden. But unfortunately, sin crept in, and they were expelled from the garden. So, as you can see, in 1656 years, the earth had become so evil and so violent that God said, I'm really sorry that I tried this. I'm going to have to destroy what happened because the whole bloodline was contaminated. But he didn't destroy everything. He kept a remnant that had not contaminated. And God said, there's hope. I'm going to start over with a new one. And so when the first flood came, when the first rains came, I can imagine the heartbreak of God, because he had to hear the cries of every human being who died in that flood. And to know that that first attempt had not worked, that people died. But then he remembered Noah. And when he came out of that ark again, when the earth was dry and Noah stepped out, God said, Noah, it's a new day on the earth. Let's begin again. And that brings us up to the present. And I know I'm a little bit early, but we'll see you all at 11.